What the dangerous Mafia boss did next stunned everyone. The body hit the warehouse floor at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and Lorenzo Vitelli didn't look down. He never did. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the Mississippi River, hands clasped behind his back, watching a barge push slow and steady through the black water below. The city breathed around him, jazz bleeding through alley walls, the sweet rot of magnolia and river mud, neon stuttering pink and gold off wet cobblestones. New Orleans, his city. Every block, every bar, every back room and counting house. His. Behind him, Marco said, "It's done." Good. Lorenzo reached into his jacket pocket and checked his phone. 7 missed calls, all from the same number, all from him to her. 0 replies. He exhaled slowly through his nose. A muscle in his jaw twitched once, the only sign that anything beneath the granite surface of Lorenzo Vitelli was alive. 3 weeks ago, he'd attended the Crescent City Children's Foundation Gala at the Ritz-Carlton on Canal Street. He'd gone out of obligation, written the check out of calculation, and had been prepared to leave in under 40 minutes. He'd done exactly this every year for 6 years. It never changed. Then she walked through the doors. She wasn't trying to be seen. That was the first thing he noticed. Every other woman in that room was performing posture perfect, laugh calibrated, smile deployed like a weapon. She moved differently. She moved like someone who had places to be, problems to solve, and approximately 0 patience for glittering nonsense. She wore a deep green dress that did something extraordinary to her coloring, and she was carrying a glass of champagne. She clearly had no intention of drinking because she kept using it to gesture when she talked. He watched her for 11 minutes before he crossed the room. He'd introduced himself simply, Lorenzo. She'd looked at him with those honey dark eyes and said, "Celeste, and before you ask, no, I'm not impressed by anyone at this party, so you can skip whatever you were about to say." He'd laughed. Actually laughed. Marco, standing 6 feet behind him, had nearly dropped his earpiece. Lorenzo Vitelli did not laugh at galas. But he laughed that night. He laughed, and he got her number, and he called her the next morning and she answered, and they talked for 47 minutes about the criminal underpinning of New Orleans real estate. She was brilliant. Louisiana ghost stories, she believed in them, which he found endearing, and the best café au lait in the city. She was wrong about her answer, but he didn't say so. He called her every day for 3 weeks, she answered. Every time. Until last Tuesday. He'd called at his usual time, 8 a.m., She was always walking to her office on Magazine Street. She always answered on the second ring. And it had rung through to voicemail. Her voice, warm and slightly amused, even in a recording. "You've reached Celeste Beaumont at Beaumont Financial Forensics. I'm unavailable. Leave a message, or don't." He'd left a message. Casual. He was Lorenzo Vitelli. He was always casual. She hadn't called back. He'd called again that evening. Voicemail. Wednesday. Voicemail. Thursday. Voicemail. By Friday, Marco had offered to look into it with a tone that implied boots and zip ties. "No," Lorenzo had said flatly. By Sunday, Sebastian Rossi, his consigliere, his most trusted advisor, the man who had stood at his right hand for 15 years, had raised one silver eyebrow over dinner and said, "It's a woman, isn't it? You've been distracted all week." Lorenzo hadn't answered, which was its own answer. Monday arrived. Her phone rang 7 times. Voicemail. Now it was Tuesday night, 11 minutes before midnight, and Lorenzo stood over a dead man's city with his phone in his hand and a sensation he hadn't felt since he was 19 years old, and standing at his father's graveside. Helplessness. "Sir," Marco said carefully, "you want me to confirm she's safe?" Just a visual, no contact. She's safe. Lorenzo said it with certainty he didn't entirely feel. She's choosing not to answer. "Women do that sometimes," Marco offered. "It usually means something went wrong." Lorenzo turned from the window. In the yellow warehouse light, his face was all shadow and angles. The face of a man carved from consequence. He was not handsome in any gentle sense of the word, He was striking the way a storm front is striking. You noticed it. You felt it in your chest. You knew to take it seriously. He picked up his jacket from the back of a chair. "Clear the morning," he said. Marco blinked. "Sir? Tomorrow. Clear it 8 o'clock. Lorenzo straightened his cuffs. 1 button. 2. Precise. And find out if the woman on Magazine Street likes gardenias or roses." Marco stared at him for 3 full seconds. "You're going to show up. I'm going to show up. To her office? To her office." A pause. "Don Vitelli, with respect, your last scheduled meeting is with the Colombo representative from Move It." "Yes, sir." Lorenzo walked toward the door, pausing with one hand on the frame. The river smell was everywhere in this city. That muddy, ancient, melancholy perfume that soaked into everything and never quite left. She hadn't answered his calls. That was fine. He would simply make himself impossible to ignore. The decision settled into him like a blade sliding home. Quiet, inevitable, and absolute. He didn't know, not yet, what she had found. He didn't know that at this exact moment, Celeste Beaumont was sitting cross-legged on her kitchen floor, 3 miles away, surrounded by printed spreadsheets, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes burning with tears. She refused to cry. He didn't know that her laptop screen showed a corporate ownership chain that ended, every single time, in a name she hadn't been able to sleep with since the moment she'd found it, Vitelli Holdings, LLC. He didn't know she'd been staring at that name for 7 days straight. And the reason she didn't answer his calls was because she couldn't trust her own voice, not to shatter into 1,000 pieces if she heard his. He didn't know any of it. He only knew she'd gone quiet. And Lorenzo Vitelli had never once in his life accepted silence as a final answer. Tomorrow, he would bring gardenias. Tomorrow, 43 employees of Beaumont Financial Forensics would witness something that would keep them talking for years. Tomorrow, the most dangerous man in New Orleans would walk through a glass lobby door with flowers in his hand and ask a woman to dinner. And tomorrow, everything, every fragile, impossible thing building between them, would crack wide open. The gardenias arrived first, 24 of them, creamy white and devastating in their sweetness. Carried through the glass door of Beaumont Financial Forensics at 8:02 a.m. by a man who looked like he'd been assembled from trouble and expensive tailoring. Lorenzo Vitelli in a lobby was an event. There was no other word for it. The receptionist, a 24-year-old named Brianna who had seen many things in her short professional life, looked up from her computer and simply stopped functioning. Her fingers rested on her keyboard. She did not type. She did not blink. She processed. The man was tall, well over 6 feet, in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent. Dark hair swept back from a face that had no right to exist in real life, a jaw you could sharpen a knife on. Gray eyes that moved slowly, deliberately, cataloging everything in the room with the calm efficiency of a man who had survived by never missing a detail. He stopped at her desk and placed the gardenias down gently. "Celeste Beaumont," he said. His voice landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Brianna pointed wordlessly toward the glass-walled office at the back. Lorenzo nodded once and thanked her, and walked. The open-plan office went silent in a ripple, like a stone thrown in a pond. Keyboards stopped. Conversations died. 38 heads turned, watching a man who moved like the room already belonged to him make his way to the back office door. Inside that office, Celeste hadn't slept. She'd been at her desk since 6, running the same ownership chains she'd been running for a week, trying to find the break. The moment where the Vitelli name diverged from the Beaumont fire, trying to find the gap that would let her breathe. She hadn't found it. She looked up when she heard the knock. He filled her doorframe. For one terrible, traitorous moment, her heart did exactly what it had been doing every time he'd called. It lurched sideways, pulled toward something warm and magnetic and entirely dangerous. 3 weeks of morning calls. His laugh, low and unexpected. The way he'd said her name like it was something worth saying carefully. Then she saw the gardenias, her mother's flowers. Her throat closed. "How did you know?" The words came out before she could stop them, and she hated herself for asking because it betrayed too much. It said, "This matters. You matter. You got through." Lorenzo stepped inside and set the flowers on her desk. He didn't sit. He was too large for the chair, too present for casual. He simply stood and looked at her with those gray eyes that saw everything. "You mentioned your mother's garden," he said quietly. "The night we talked about the Garden District houses, you said gardenias were the only smell that made you feel safe." She had said that. She remembered the exact moment. It was raining, she was walking under her umbrella, and he'd asked what her favorite smell was, and she'd answered without thinking and then felt inexplicably exposed. He'd remembered. Celeste pressed her lips together. "Put the walls up. All of them." "Lorenzo." She kept her voice level. "Professional. I've been busy. I apologize for not returning your calls." "You don't apologize like someone who's sorry," he observed. "You apologize like someone who's decided something. Too sharp, too damn perceptive." "I think," she started. "There are 2 men parked outside your building," he interrupted, his voice dropping, losing all warmth, going to something hard and flat and serious. "Black Navigator. They've been there since yesterday morning. They're not police." The cold swept through her. She'd noticed the Navigator, but told herself she was being paranoid. She was an accountant. No one surveilled accountants. Except, apparently, they did. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, because what else could she say? "Yes, you do." He didn't move closer, didn't invade her space. He just held her gaze and said, with an absolute certainty that reached through her ribs and grabbed, "Something frightened you, Celeste. You found something, or you heard something, and it made you go quiet. And I'm standing here telling you that whatever it is, it put you in danger. Those men outside are not going to wait forever." Her jaw tightened. She would not flinch. She would not show him a single crack. "You think you know." "I think," he said, stepping forward once, only once, close enough now that she could smell cedar and something darker beneath it, "that you are one of the most intelligent women I have ever met. Which means you already know I'm right. Which means this conversation is just you deciding how much to trust me." "I don't trust you," she said. "True. Also a lie." "I know." Something moved in his eyes. Not hurt, exactly, but adjacent to it. "Come with me anyway. I'm not going anywhere with you. Those men outside have a photograph of you. They know your routines. They know you take the streetcar home on Tuesdays." He paused. "Let that land. Come with me voluntarily, or I put you over my shoulder in front of all 40-something of your employees. Your choice. I'd prefer you choose the version that maintains your dignity." Celeste stared at him. Through the glass wall, she could see Brianna and approximately 30 other colleagues doing a spectacular and entirely unsuccessful job of pretending not to watch. She thought about the spreadsheets, about the name, about the warehouse fire and her parents and 8 years of not knowing why. She thought about the Black Navigator. "You have answers," she said. "Not a question. I have resources. And I have very motivated people who will hurt you to get to me." He held her gaze. "Come with me while you still have the option of walking out under your own power." She hated that it made sense. She hated that she believed him. She hated most of all that despite everything she knew, despite the name on the spreadsheet burning in her bag, the part of her that had spent 3 weeks answering his calls wanted to go. She stood up, picked up her bag, her coat. She walked past him to the door and paused, not looking at him. "If you touch me without permission," she said quietly, "I will remove your hand from your wrist." A beat of silence. "Noted," he said, and she could hear the very edge of a smile in it, which was infuriating. They walked through the office together. 38 people watched. No one said a single word. Brianna pressed her hand to her heart. Outside, the Black Navigator was gone. Lorenzo opened the back door of a matte black Escalade, and Marco, enormous, silent, watchful, was behind the wheel. Celeste got in. Lorenzo slid in beside her. The city moved past the window. Her city. Wrought iron and heat and beauty threaded through with danger, just like everything else she loved. She clutched her bag in her lap. Inside it, the spreadsheets. Inside them, his name. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe," Lorenzo said. She almost laughed. Safe, with the man whose company name was stitched into the worst night of her life. She would find her answers. She would get out. And she absolutely, categorically was not going to let herself feel a single thing for Lorenzo Vitelli. The car turned onto St. Mum, Charles Avenue, and his mansion rose ahead. Wrought iron gates and magnolia trees and columns white as bones, and Celeste Beaumont walked inside of her own free will. The gates closed behind her. "I own you now," he didn't say. He didn't need to. The sound of the lock said it for him. The Vitelli estate had 41 rooms. Celeste counted them. She counted them the way she counted everything, methodically, as armor. Because numbers didn't lie, and they didn't betray you. And when the world became too large and too frightening, you could always reduce it to something manageable. A sequence. A pattern. A thing with edges. 41 rooms, 12 on the ground floor, 14 on the second, 9 on the third. 6 basement level that she was fairly sure she wasn't meant to have found. She found them anyway on her second day, because she found everything eventually. Her room was on the second floor. It smelled of old wood and beeswax candles and something faintly floral she couldn't name. The bed was absurdly comfortable. The window overlooked a courtyard where a fountain ran constantly, that soft, eternal sound of water on stone that she'd fallen asleep to both nights here, despite herself. She was not a prisoner. Lorenzo had made that explicitly clear on the first morning, standing in the marble foyer with his hands in his pockets, watching her with that gray-eyed calm that unnerved her more than anger would have. "You can leave when the threat is neutralized," he'd said. "Until then, you stay. You have full run of the house. You'll have a phone, monitored, yes, before you ask. Your work files will be brought to you. Marco will take you to see your aunt tomorrow if you wish." "And my freedom?" she'd asked. "Temporarily inconvenienced," he'd said with a precision that walked the line between arrogant and honest. And she hadn't been able to find a satisfying argument against it. So she'd stayed, mapped the house, watched him. That was the thing about Lorenzo Vitelli. Watching him was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with violence. He ran his empire from the house's east wing study. Door open more often than not, and she could see him from the hallway. At his desk in shirt sleeves, jackets off, reading reports and making calls in a voice that carried just enough to confirm he was conducting business she wasn't supposed to understand. But she understood Italian, her mother's tongue, her grandmother's kitchen language, and she understood more than he knew. She learned his empire in pieces. The Vitellis controlled Port Authority contracts through 3 subsidiary companies. All of them legal on the surface, all of them bleeding cash to operations that existed nowhere on any tax return. They controlled 3 city councilmen, a judge, and 2 police captains through a combination of money and what Lorenzo called, in Italian, favori dovuti, debts owed. His territory ran from the warehouse district through the Marigny and into the 9th Ward. His rivals, the Mendez cartel moving up from the Gulf and a Russian operation testing his eastern borders, were being handled with a combination of diplomacy and targeted violence that Celeste understood instinctively because it was, structurally, exactly how she handled a hostile audit. Identify the pressure point, apply force precisely, never show the full picture. She was thinking about this on the 3rd afternoon when she found the study empty and made a decision she would either not regret or deeply regret, depending on how the next 10 minutes went. She went in. The desk was clean. Lorenzo was organized in a way she hadn't expected. Not military precise, but personal, orderly. The desk of a man who knew where everything was because he'd put it there himself. Books in 3 languages. A framed photograph turned away from the visitor's angle, visible only from his chair. She crossed to it before she could stop herself. A woman, late 50s, dark hair silvered at the temples, laughing at something off camera. Beautiful in the way of women who'd had hard lives and come through with their dignity intact. Something in the shape of her eyes was very familiar. "My mother?" Celeste spun. Lorenzo stood in the doorway, jacket over one arm, tie loosened, looking at her with an expression that wasn't quite anger. Something quieter. Something that made her chest ache despite every single thing she knew. "She died when I was 22, he said, walking into the room as if she hadn't just been caught trespassing. He set his jacket over the chair and looked at the photograph. "Cardiac arrest, 4 years after my father." He paused. "She never wanted this life for me. She used to say." He stopped. "What?" The word left her before she could catch it. He looked at her. "She used to say that the Vitelli name was a beautiful coat lined with broken glass, magnificent from the outside, cuts you open if you put it on." The silence stretched. Outside, a mockingbird was doing an aggressive impression of every other bird in Louisiana. "Why are you telling me this?" Celeste asked carefully. "Because you were going to find it anyway," he said simply. "You find everything. I've watched you the last 3 days, Celeste. You're not frightened of me. You're studying me, measuring the distance between what I am and what you need me to be. Don't let him be right. Do not let him be right. Your company," she said, because she was through circling. "Vitelli Holdings. Tell me about the 2017 acquisition of Beaumont Maritime." His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A subtle shift, a recalibration. "Beaumont Maritime," he repeated. "My parents' shipping company," she said. "They died in a warehouse fire in October 2017. 2 months later, their company was absorbed by a holding shell that traces back to you." The silence was different now. Heavier. The mockingbird had stopped. "Who told you the acquisition traces to me?" His voice was careful, precise. "No one told me. I followed the money. It's what I do." She held her ground, every nerve in her body screaming. "My parents died, Lorenzo. They died, and your name is on everything that came after." He was very still for a long moment, the way a very large, very controlled thing goes still before it decides what to do. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather, please," he said. And the word cost him something. She could hear it. "Sit down." She sat. He pulled the chair from behind the desk and sat across from her, forearms on his knees, close enough that she could see the exhaustion beneath his eyes that she'd been cataloging and hadn't allowed herself to care about. "I need to ask you something," he said quietly. "And I need you to understand that the answer matters to me more than it probably should." A breath. "The Beaumont Maritime acquisition. Who brought it to me? Who handled the acquisition documents?" She stared. "You don't know?" "I sign 100 documents a week, Celeste. I approved a maritime logistics acquisition in 2017 on the recommendation of my consigliere." His eyes were steady on hers. Not evasive, not performing innocence. Something far more disturbing. Something that looked like dawning horror. "I want the name of the law firm on the incorporation documents." Her hands moved before her brain caught up. She had the spreadsheets in her bag. Of course she did. She pulled them out, 3 pages, marked and annotated in her precise handwriting, and found the line. "Rossi Legal Partners," she read. "Registered agent, Sebastian R." Lorenzo sat back. A muscle worked in his jaw. His hands, resting on his knees, curled once into fists and released. "Sebastian," he said, and his voice was so quiet she almost didn't catch the earthquake moving underneath it. From outside, down the hall, she heard the soft thump of the front door. Marco returning, voices in the foyer. Normal sounds. House sounds. And beneath them, barely audible, a creak from the east side of the garden that shouldn't have been there because the iron gate to the east garden was locked, and she knew exactly what a locked gate sounded like when someone who shouldn't be there opened it anyway. Someone's watching. Someone's here. She looked at Lorenzo. His head had lifted. He'd heard it too. Those gray eyes met hers. "Get behind me," he said. She was already moving. 3 men. East Garden. Armed. Lorenzo had them at a disadvantage the moment they came through the gate because Lorenzo Vitelli had owned this house for 16 years, and he knew every shadow and every corner of it, and because Marco, hearing something shift in the frequency of the house the way a man learns to after enough years of violent service, came through the study door with a weapon drawn before the intruder's boots had fully cleared the garden path. It was over in approximately 90 seconds. Not cleanly. One of the men got a shot off that took a chip out of the study door frame and sent plaster dust raining down on Celeste's hair as she pressed herself flat against the interior wall, exactly as Lorenzo had positioned her, but over. 3 men disarmed, 1 unconscious, 2 kneeling in the garden with zip ties on their wrists and a look in their eyes that said they had not expected this to go this way. Lorenzo moved through it like weather, efficient, unhurried. A violence that was almost aesthetic in its precision. No excess, no performance, just clean and final force applied exactly where it needed to be. He crouched in front of the senior of the 2 kneeling men, grabbed him by the collar, said something low in Italian that Celeste, from the doorway, caught most of and wished she hadn't. Then he stood, straightened his shirt, walked back to her. He was close before she noticed the blood. "You're hit," she said. The words came out wrong. Too flat, too controlled, the voice she used when she was afraid and refused to be. A neat slice along his left forearm where the bullet had grazed him, not deep, not dangerous, but bleeding freely down toward his wrist. "It's fine," he said. "It's bleeding. Most things do when cut." He looked at her face. "You're shaking." "I'm not. Your hands are." She looked down. They were. She pressed them flat against her thighs. "I'm fine." "You're allowed to be frightened," he said, and his voice had gone somewhere different. The authority stripped away. Something underneath it that was simply human. "It doesn't make you weaker. Don't." She didn't look at him. "Don't be kind to me right now. I can't." She pressed her lips together. He waited. He was extraordinarily good at waiting, she'd noticed. Most powerful men filled silence with their own voice. He didn't. He held it, offered it back, and waited to see what you'd do with it. What she did was take his arm. She didn't think about it. She simply crossed to the wet bar in the corner of the study. Because of course there was a wet bar. It was that kind of study. Found a clean cloth, ran it under water, and came back and took his forearm in both hands and pressed the cloth to the cut. His intake of breath was barely audible. She kept her eyes on the wound, on the work, on the familiar, manageable task of cleaning and assessing. She'd done this for her aunt a dozen times. For her college roommate who was catastrophically accident-prone, she knew how to do this. She focused on it with the full force of her attention, because if she looked up, she would have to look at him, and he was too close and too still, and the room smelled of cordite and his cedar and dark cologne, and she was very much in danger of doing something irreversible. His arm was warm in her hands, solid, alive. "You're in so much trouble," she told herself. "You found the incorporation documents on your own," he said quietly, above her head. "You traced 6 layers of shell companies without any of my resources. Do you know how many forensic analysts I employ who couldn't do that? I don't work for you." "No, you don't." A pause. "I would like you, too." She laughed despite herself. Short, sharp, genuine. "You want to hire the woman whose parents died in a fire connected to your company, after kidnapping her from her own office." Bold. "I didn't kidnap you. You walked in voluntarily. Under duress. Under considerable personal charm," he corrected. And there it was, that very specific quality of dry humor she'd heard on the phone all those mornings, the thing that had made her answer again and again, and her chest did something complicated and inconvenient. She finished tying off the cloth and should have stepped back. She didn't step back. She looked up. He was already looking at her. He'd been looking at her through all of it, she realized. Through the cleaning and the bandaging and the careful, professional focus, he'd been watching her face with an expression that had no business living on a man like him. Something open. Something that asked. "Celeste," he said. "Don't," she said. But it came out as a whisper, which was not what she'd intended. "I didn't know about your parents." His voice was very low. "I want you to hear me say that. I didn't know what was inside that acquisition. I didn't know the fire was connected, And I need you to know that when I find out the full truth, when I have confirmation of what Sebastian Rossi did, I will burn every single thing he built and scatter the ashes in the Gulf." She believed him. She hated that she believed him. Every instinct she'd trained over a decade of following money through lies and false fronts said, "This is real. He's telling the truth." "That doesn't fix anything," she said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." His free hand rose, slowly, giving her every opportunity to move, and tucked a curl back from her face. Just that. Just his knuckles against her cheek for one brief, careful moment. "But I'd like the chance to try." Her breath caught. She should have stepped back 3 minutes ago. She should have stepped back the moment she'd reached for his arm. She should probably have answered his first call with a recorded legal statement and a cease and desist. She hadn't. And when he tilted his head and waited, still waiting, always waiting, giving her the choice, she closed the final 2 inches of distance herself. The kiss was not what she expected. She'd expected force, possession, something that matched the man she'd built in her mind from spreadsheets and power structures and the fear response of 2 armed men who'd knelt for him without being asked. Instead, soft, deliberate, his hand curved around her jaw like she was something that could be broken. And he kissed her with an attention that undid her more thoroughly than any aggression could have, like the 47-minute phone call. Like the gardenias, like the way he remembered every detail she'd ever offered him and held on to it. When he pulled back, his eyes were darker. "I'll burn the world for you," he said, very quietly, "before I let anyone hurt you again." She pressed her fingers against her mouth. Took a step back, then 2. "I need to think," she said. "I know," he said, and he let her go. She walked out of the study into the long hallway, and behind her, she heard him say something to Marco, low and controlled, and she did not look back. Because if she looked back, she would go back, and that was something she absolutely could not afford. Not yet. Not until she knew everything. Not until she knew all of it. The Vitelli family met on Thursday evenings. Celeste found this out because on Thursday at 7 p.m., 8 black cars arrived at the front gate, and 12 men she'd never seen filed into the house and disappeared into the basement dining room and didn't come up for 3 hours. Lorenzo had looked at her at 6:50, where she was reading at the kitchen table, and said simply, "Stay on the 2nd floor tonight." She'd nodded. She'd meant it. She lasted 45 minutes. The basement dining room had a ventilation shaft that ran up through the kitchen pantry. Old house. Original architecture. Nobody had ever bothered to reroute it because nobody had ever lived in this house who would think to look. She sat on the pantry floor in her socks with her ear 3 inches from the vent and her notes app open on her phone. And she listened. She understood approximately 70% of what was said. The rest was too fast, too regional, too weighted with references she didn't have context for. But she understood enough. The Mendez cartel had made a move on Vitelli docking rights at Port Nola. 3 shipping containers had been diverted, rerouted through Mendez channels. A message. A line crossed. Lorenzo's response. She could hear the shift in the room as he spoke. That particular quality of attention that happened when the head of something speaks was measured and absolute. Restore the containers. Return the captains. And send Ricardo Mendez a personal invitation to a conversation in which his continued participation in this city will be determined. Not loud. Not theatrical, just final. Then the money. She sat up straighter. Sebastian Rossi's voice. She'd met him once. Silver-haired, elegant, the kind of man who'd practiced seeming trustworthy until it became reflex, was presenting the quarterly accounts. Revenue streams, allocation, projected reinvestment. He spoke smoothly. He always spoke smoothly. But Celeste was a forensic accountant. And 2 of the numbers Sebastian cited were wrong, not grossly wrong, not wrong in the way an amateur skims, wrong in the meticulous, layered, sophisticated way of someone who had been doing this for a very long time and knew exactly which numbers could be adjusted without triggering pattern recognition. The kind of wrong she spent her professional life finding. 12,000 here, 47 there, across a quarterly report, absorbed into legitimate line items. Virtually invisible. Except to her, Sebastian Rossi is stealing from Lorenzo Vitelli. And if he was stealing, then he had a reason to make sure nobody looked too closely at the books. And if nobody looked at the books, then the Beaumont Maritime acquisition, with its clean paper trail and its legal firm registered under his own name, had been invisible for 8 years. Had been invisible until a forensic accountant started asking questions. The cold clarity of it settled over her like still water. He knows I'm here. He knows what I found, those men in the garden. They weren't sent by Mendez, they were sent by Sebastian. She had her phone out, notes open, when she heard the footstep behind her. She was on her feet in 2 seconds. Back to the pantry shelf, body angled for the door. Years of self-defense classes at the Y on Frenchman Street. Her aunt's insistence after the fire, "You will know how to protect yourself, girl," came back like muscle memory. The pantry door opened. Lorenzo. He looked at her. At her phone, notes visible. At her general position of was definitely eavesdropping. She lifted her chin. Sebastian Rossi is skimming. Something moved through his face. "I know," he said. "I've known for 3 months. I've been building a case." His eyes were steady on hers. "And I need to ask you something that requires a completely honest answer." She waited. "Did you come to the Dala 3 weeks ago by accident?" The question landed with surgical precision. She felt it in her sternum. She could lie. She'd considered lying, in the abstract, as a strategy, but standing here in a pantry 3 feet from him, with the knowledge of what she'd heard and what she knew, and the feel of his kiss still living somewhere complicated in her memory, she didn't. "No," she said. "I went because I was tracking the shell companies. I thought someone at the Vitelli table might let something slip." A breath. "I didn't expect to meet you. I didn't expect." She stopped. "You didn't expect to like me," he said. It wasn't gloating. It was just accurate. "I found your name in my parents' death," she said. "The same week I started to... Yes, I liked you. And then I found it and I couldn't tell which thing to do with that." He crossed to the small window above the shelf. Outside, the courtyard, the fountain, the magnolia branches dark against the lit sky. "My father brought Sebastian Rossi into this family when I was 15, he said. "He trained under my father. He stood at my father's right hand for 20 years. He stood at mine for 15 more. He is." He paused, and she heard the weight of it, the complicated grief of a man betrayed by the closest thing to a brother he had. "He is the only person I ever fully trusted." "I'm sorry," she said, because she meant it. He turned to look at her. "The blood oath in this family is simple. Latosser sopra ogni cosa. Loyalty above everything." He took that oath. He ate at this table. His voice was quiet and absolutely lethal. "Whatever he took from me, I can absorb. What he took from me," his jaw tightened, "that I will not. Lorenzo, your parents." He said it like the words were something he was carrying carefully. "Tell me about them." She didn't expect that. She didn't expect the gentleness of it. The particular patience of a man who never rushed anything that mattered. So she told him. Amélie and Jacques Beaumont, her mother, who grew gardenias and spoke Italian and made the best red beans and rice in the 7th Ward. Her father, who ran the shipping company her grandfather had built, and who taught her double-entry bookkeeping at the kitchen table because knowledge is the only thing they can't take from you. Chouette, who died in a fire that the fire marshal called an accident, and that Celeste had always, and the part of her that never stopped counting, known was not. By the time she finished, her voice was steady. She told this story before. She knew how to tell it without breaking, but his hand had moved across the small distance between them and taken hers, not possessive, not claiming, just there, his thumb moving slowly across her knuckles back and forth, like a man who didn't know he was doing it. "Oh no," she thought. "Oh, this is so much worse than I thought." From below, muffled to the floor, she heard the sound of chairs scraping, of men rising from a long table. The meeting was ending, and somewhere in the city, Sebastian Rossi was watching and planning and believing he was still safe. He wouldn't be safe for much longer. Celeste looked at the man beside her. Complicated, dangerous, half made of darkness and half of something she didn't yet have a word for, and felt the thing she'd been refusing to feel for 3 weeks settle into her bones like a fact. You're in love with him. You might have been in love with him since that first phone call. And that is either the beginning of everything or the end of everything. And you genuinely don't know which. Below, voices, footsteps, the sound of men departing. Above, the fountain running. Between them, the warm, impossible fact of his hand in hers. Something was coming. She could feel it the way her mother had always felt the storms. Before the clouds, before the wind, in the quality of the air, the particular stillness that comes just before everything changes. It came the next morning, a gunshot through the courtyard window at first light. The war, it seemed, had decided not to wait. The bullet came through the eastern courtyard window at 6:14 a.m. and took out a pane of glass 12 inches above Celeste's head. She was already awake. She'd been awake since 5, sitting in the window seat with coffee and the spreadsheets. She refused to stop running, watching the courtyard fill with morning light. The shot cracked the silence apart, and she dropped flat, immediate, without thinking, off the window seat and onto the floor, dragging the curtain down behind her as cover, already moving toward the door because the window seat was exposure and the interior wall was not. 3 seconds. Floor to wall to crouched position with her back flat against solid plaster. She heard herself breathing. Measured it. Down the hall. Boots. Multiple sets. Fast and purposeful. Marco's voice giving clipped orders. Then Lorenzo's voice, and the tone of it. Low and furious in a way she hadn't heard before. Something that lived well below the controlled register he normally occupied. Cutting through all of it. The door opened. Lorenzo came through it low and fast, scanning the room, finding her against the wall. And the breath he let out when he saw her standing and unbloodied was the most honest sound she'd ever heard him make. He crossed to her in 4 steps. His hands came up and cupped her face. Both hands. Careful and urgent at once. And he turned her head left, right, checking her. Looking for damage. His eyes were doing something she'd never seen them do before. They were afraid. Lorenzo Vitelli was afraid. For her. I'm fine, she said. I'm fine, it went over me. You're sure? I'm sure. He exhaled. His forehead dropped against hers for one brief, fierce moment. Less than a second, barely a breath, and she felt the whole weight of him in it. All the control and the cold precision and the power pressed against her forehead for 1 second of pure, unguarded relief. Then it was gone. The mask back. The dawn returned. He stepped back. His hands dropped. He turned to Marco in the doorway. Source? Northeast corner. Shooter was on the Duval building rooftop. Already gone. Marco's jaw was tight. Professional. 1 shot. If she'd been sitting straight. She wasn't. Lorenzo's voice was flat as iron. Rossi? Probable. Confirmed or probable? 92%. The Duval building is owned by a Rossi shell we identified last month. Lorenzo turned to the window. To the broken glass. The morning light was coming gold and ordinary through the hole in it, and it was so obscene, the beauty of the light and the violence of the opening, that Celeste felt something shift in her. She'd been measuring him for weeks, cataloging, calculating, building a case that was partly about her parents and partly, she admitted this now, here, on this side of a bullet, about protecting herself from what she felt for him, keeping a professional distance between Celeste Beaumont, the forensic investigator, and Celeste Beaumont, the woman who answered his calls in the rain and remembered the exact timbre of his laugh. Looking at him now, at the way he stood at the window, at the particular quality of the fury in his profile, at a man who was made of violence being undone by the nearness of violence to her, she stopped calculating. She crossed the room and put her hand on his back. He stilled. We end this, she said. Together. I have everything. The incorporation chain, the skimming records, the maritime acquisition documents. I can build the financial case that buries him. You have the resources to make sure he doesn't get to a courtroom. She felt him breathe. But I need you to promise me something. He turned. His eyes, always so controlled, were storm dark. Anything, he said. You don't move on him until I'm with you. You don't make a decision about Sebastian Rossi that I'm not part of." She held his gaze. "My parents deserve that." "They do." He reached up and covered her hand where it rested on his chest. His fingers closed around hers. "Warm and certain, and you deserve to be there when it ends. One more thing. Tell me." She looked up at him. This complicated, dangerous, exhausting man who remembered she liked gardenias and who showed up with flowers in a lobby and who had just pressed his forehead against hers like she was the only solid thing in a tilting world. "I answered your calls," she said quietly, "because I liked you before I knew who you were. And I need you to know that." A breath. "Even when I was angry, even when I found your name in the worst thing that ever happened to me, I still..." She stopped. He didn't let her stop. He kissed her like the glass hadn't shattered, like the morning wasn't ringed with danger, like there was all the time in the world and she was the only person in it, deep and certain and possessive in the way that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with "I have been waiting for this, and I refuse to waste another minute." When they broke apart, he held her face in his hands and looked at her with those storm-colored eyes and said, very quietly, the words that would later echo through everything that came after, "You're mine, Celeste. And that means no one touches what's mine. No one." "You're mine too," she said. "Fair warning." His smile, when it came, was the rarest thing she'd ever been given. Outside, the magnolia swayed in the morning breeze and the city hummed its old, eternal song. And somewhere on the other side of it all, Sebastian Rossi was loading his next move. And somewhere in this room, over broken glass and morning light, the beginning of a war became inevitable. The war was coming. And neither of them intended to lose. War in the Vitelli family didn't look like it did in the movies. There were no capos making speeches in wood-paneled rooms, no dramatic declarations in cathedral courtyards. It was quieter, more efficient. More like the moment a weather system decides it's done warning you and simply becomes itself. Lorenzo declared it on a Monday morning over coffee in the kitchen. In a voice so calm Celeste had to replay the sentence twice to confirm he'd said what she thought he'd said. "Effective today," he told Marco, "Sebastian Rossi is no longer consigliere. He is a target. All accounts are frozen, all communications monitored. The harbor contract access is revoked." He set his coffee cup down. "And I want every man he's touched in this family identified and separated from operational authority by end of business." Marco nodded. "Timeline. We don't give him time to run." Lorenzo looked at Celeste across the kitchen table. She had her laptop open. The financial models she'd been building for 3 days spread across the screen. A color-coded trail of Sebastian's embezzlement illuminated in red and gold, and damning. "How close are you?" "I have enough to hand to the FBI today," she said. "The maritime acquisition fraud, the embezzlement, and 2 counts of wire fraud, with paper trails clean enough for a federal prosecutor to sing." She paused. "I'm 2 days from having the connection to the fire. The arson investigators report. There's a payment that traces to a Rossi account. I need to pull one more thread." "You have 2 days," Lorenzo said. After that, I know. You'll do it your way. My way and your way both end at the same place," he said. "We just take different roads. The same destination, Sebastian Rossi facing the full consequence of what he'd done. She could live with that." The first 3 days of war were surgical. Vitelli accounts disappeared from Sebastian's access. His personal accounts, which Marco's people had been monitoring, began showing the scramble of a man realizing his money was being systematically removed from his reach. 3 of his personal guards were confronted by Marco's people and offered a simple choice: walk away from Sebastian's employ, or don't walk away at all. 2 walked, 1 had to be persuaded. The 4th day, Sebastian struck back. He hit the Marigny counting house first. 3 of Lorenzo's men were inside when the building's gas line was compromised. They got out. The building didn't. Celeste heard the explosion from the estate, a low percussive thud that rattled the windows and brought Lorenzo to his feet in the study. Then the dock foreman, Tommy Arsenault, loyal to the Vitellis for 22 years, family man, man who'd attended Lorenzo's father's funeral, was found beaten in the 9th ward. Alive? Barely. Message received. And then, on the morning of the 5th day, Marco took a bullet. Not fatal. The bullet hit his left shoulder clean through, and he'd had the presence of mind to keep driving and make it back to the estate before he bled enough to matter. Celeste was in the courtyard when the car came in too fast and the door opened and Marco's enormous frame came out sideways, one hand braced on the frame, dark stains spreading over his jacket. She moved before anyone else did. "Kitchen," she said. "Now, Marco, can you walk?" He nodded, already moving. Grim-faced and silent, in that particular way of men who'd been shot before and found it more inconvenient than surprising. "Lorenzo." She turned and he was right behind her, face like stone, eyes tracking the wound with clinical intensity. "I need the first aid kit, and I need whoever here has the most medical training." "Gillies," Lorenzo said immediately. "3rd floor, former army medic. Get him." She moved into the kitchen. Marco sat heavily in the chair she pulled out. She already had her hands on his jacket, assessing the damage, and Marco, 6'3", 240 pounds of iron will, looked at her small hands working efficiently on his shoulder and said, very quietly, "You're something, aren't you?" "Focus on breathing," she said. "The dawn is looking at you like breathing, Marco." Jules came. The bullet had passed clean through. Lorenzo stood in the kitchen doorway through all of it, a quality of silence around him that Celeste had learned to read. The silence before something irreversible. When Jill confirmed Marco would keep the shoulder, Lorenzo stepped outside. Celeste followed. He was on the back porch, looking at the garden. The magnolias were very still. "Sebastian called me," he said without turning. "While you were inside, he called my personal phone, a number only people inside this family have." She waited. "He told me he had something of mine." Lorenzo turned. His face was controlled. Too controlled. The kind of control that took extreme effort to maintain. He said if I wanted it back undamaged, I would come to the old Baymont warehouse on the river at midnight. Alone. A beat. He said he has my accountant. The cold hit her like a wall. She looked at her own hands, at the blood on them from Marco's shoulder. She looked up. Lorenzo was looking at her and the expression behind the control. The fear again, that same raw thing she'd seen the morning of the gunshot, was back, and it undid her. "But I'm here," she said. "I know." He crossed to her in 2 steps. His hands cupped her face the way they had before, tilted it up. "He thinks you're still in the East Wing. We put someone in your room 2 hours ago, precaution. He's been watching the wrong window." She processed. "He set a trap using me as bait." "Yes, and you're not going." "I'm absolutely going, with 12 men and enough firepower to end this conversation permanently." His thumbs traced her cheekbones once. "But I need you to stay here." Locked room. "Gilles and 2 others. You do not leave for any reason." "Lorenzo, please." The word again. She was learning it as the most rare thing he had. "Let me handle this. You've done your part. The financial case is built. Let me do mine." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Come back," she said. "Without question," he said. He kissed her forehead, brief, fierce. He turned and walked away into the house, already speaking low into his phone. And Celeste stood on the back porch, with the taste of his kiss on her skin, and the heavy, prophetic certainty that something was about to go very wrong. She went to her room. She locked the door. And 40 minutes later, someone cut the power to the entire estate. In the darkness and the confusion, they took her anyway. Not through the window. Not through the door. Through the kitchen where Marco lay sedated with painkillers, through the pantry with its old ventilation shaft, through the servants' passage that hadn't been on any blueprint she'd been shown. Sebastian Rossi, it turned out, knew the house better than she did. The warehouse smelled like rust and river water and old wood that had been soaking up Louisiana heat for a century. Celeste had been in this warehouse before. She hadn't been inside it. She'd stood outside it, twice, in the weeks after the fire, when the police tape was still up and the investigators were still pretending to care. and she'd stood on the banquet and looked at the blackened facade and tried to understand how ordinary wood became the thing that ended her parents. Now she sat in a chair in its interior with her wrists zip-tied to the arms and understood, finally, the full architecture of the night her world had ended. Sebastian Rossi stood across from her in a cream linen suit that was outrageously inappropriate for a man conducting abduction and probable murder, and he looked at her with the particular expression of someone who believes themselves to be both intelligent and underestimated. He was right about one of those things. "You're exceptional," he told her. "Genuinely. I've been moving money through Vitelli accounts for 11 years and not one auditor, not one accountant, not one forensic analyst found the pattern." He tilted his head. "You found it in a week. Remarkable. I found it in 3 days," she said. "The rest of the week I was confirming." He smiled. Thin. "Of course." "The Beaumont fire," she said, keeping her voice level. Controlled. She was measuring the zip ties. Left wrist, tighter. Right wrist, small movement range. If she rotated her thumb, "You paid the investigator to call it an accident." "I paid the investigator to write a specific narrative, yes." He clasped his hands behind his back, walking a slow circuit around her. "Your father was asking questions. Not about the Vitella specifically. He didn't know about that yet. He was asking about the logistics rerouting. 3 of his ships had been used to move product without his knowledge. He was going to talk to the port authority." A pause. "I couldn't have that. So you killed them." "I solved a problem." He said it the way you'd describe restructuring a budget. Lorenzo signed the acquisition documents the following week, believing he was absorbing a legitimate logistics company. He never asked about the previous ownership. He trusted me to handle the details. A beat. "He always trusted me to handle the details." "And the money you skimmed," Celeste said. "What was it for?" Sebastian paused in his circuit. For the first time, something moved in his face that was genuine. "Freedom," he said quietly. 40 years in this family. 40 years of being the second name, the trusted advisor, the one who handles the details while someone else sits at the head of the table. He looked at her with something that might have been, in another life, grief. Lorenzo is an extraordinary man. He is also incapable of understanding what it costs to serve him. "So you built an exit fund." "I built a life," he said, "one that doesn't require me to clean up anyone else's consequences." He resumed walking. "Unfortunately, you became a consequence." She heard a door open above her. A catwalk level, she thought. She'd felt the structural vibration in the chair legs. 1, 2, 3 men minimum. She'd heard their positions shift when she'd been brought in. The man directly behind her she could hear breathing. The one at the door, left, toward the river exit. The one above, moving right to left. Her right thumb was almost clear. "Lorenzo is going to come here," she said, keeping him talking. "I'm counting on it," Sebastian said. He received the call. He'll come with force and fury, he always does, and in the confusion, you and I will not be here. The men he finds will slow him down. He stopped in front of her. "You'll be on a boat out of Port Nola before he clears this building." "He'll find me," she said. Not bravado, just fact. "Probably," Sebastian conceded. "He's extraordinary, as I said." A pause. "But by then the financial documents will be in the hands of people who would very much like to use them to dismantle the Vitelli Empire, which means Lorenzo will have rather more pressing concerns than." Her right wrist came free. She'd been working the zip tie in micro movements the entire conversation, rotating her thumb, compressing the tissue at the base of her wrist the way her Tante security consultant friend had once shown her could be done if you were patient enough and kept someone talking. She drove the heel of her free hand up into Sebastian's nose. The crack was deeply satisfying. He reeled back. She was on her feet, the chair going sideways, her left wrist still tied to the arm. She swung it like a flail, the chair leg catching the man who'd been behind her across the side of the face as he lunged. She ran for the river exit. The man at the door was faster than she'd hoped. She caught his arm, redirected his momentum the way she'd been taught. Use his size against him. Use the angle. You are not trying to be stronger. You are trying to be smarter. And he went into the wall shoulder first with a sound like a side of beef. but his hand caught her ankle and she went down hard on the concrete floor, palm stinging, knee taking the impact, vision strobing for one dangerous second. She heard Sebastian behind her, voice thick with blood. "Don't damage her, she's worth more intact. Worth more." She breathed. She was on the floor. Her left hand was still tied to a chair arm. Her knee was screaming. She had, very approximately, 12 seconds before someone picked her up. She wasn't going to break. She'd promised herself a long time ago, standing outside a burned warehouse on a cold October morning at 23 years old, with a police officer telling her it was just an accident, that she would not break over this. Not over grief and not over fear and not over the particular bone-deep weight of being a woman alone in a room full of dangerous men. She looked up. Sebastian was 15 feet away, hand to his face, blood dark on his cream suit. His eyes, cold, intelligent, calculating, were on her. "You're done running," he said. "Not yet," she said, and through the wall behind him, with the sound of an earthquake wrapped in controlled fury, the river-facing door exploded inward. Lorenzo came through the door first. This was, Marco would later say, against protocol. This was the moment every tactical principle in the Vitelli operational playbook said send the men first. This was the moment a Don with any professional distance between himself and the situation would have stood back and let his soldiers clear the room. Lorenzo Vitelli sent his men through the upper and left entrances and came through the river door himself. Because Celeste was on that floor, he saw her in the first half second, on the ground, zip tie on one wrist, chair arms still attached, face set in the expression he'd seen before and could only describe as not broken, not even close, and very angry. And the thing living in his chest since the moment he'd found her room empty, and the estate compromised expanded to fill his entire body. Cold, absolute, merciless. He crossed the warehouse floor in 7 strides, while his men came through the other entrances behind him. Sebastian's men, 6 of them, positioned at catwalk and floor level, made their calculations and found them insufficient. Marco's team at the upper level was efficient and thorough. 2 of Sebastian's people ran. 1 fired. The shot went wide by a foot, and the man who fired was given exactly 1 opportunity to reconsider his choices. He didn't reconsider. Sebastian stood in the middle of the floor with blood on his face and his hands and his cream suit, and a quality of calculation still running behind his eyes even now, even here, that Lorenzo recognized with the sick intimacy of 15 years at this man's side. He was still looking for the angle. There wasn't one. Lorenzo crouched beside Celeste. His knife was out and the zip tie was cut in 2 seconds. He took the chair arm off her wrist, checked the skin, checked her face, ran his hands down her arms, and she let him, watching his face with those honey eyes that saw everything. "I'm okay," she said. Her voice was steady. "My knee is bruised and my palm is cut, but I'm okay." A pause. "His nose is broken." "I did that." "I know," he said. He could see it from here. "Good." She put her hand on his arm. "Lorenzo." He looked at her. "Not just for me," she said, "for my parents." He understood. He held her gaze for one moment, one complete, wordless exchange in which they said everything that mattered, and then he stood. He turned to Sebastian. Sebastian, to his credit, didn't attempt anything theatrical. He'd done the math. He looked at Lorenzo with the expression of a man who'd expected to lose this, and had simply hoped it would take longer. "You knew," Lorenzo said. Not accusing, stating, "You knew everything about the Beaumont fire and you said nothing." "I did what was necessary," Sebastian said. His voice was steady, still composed. "For the family, and for myself. And if I'd found out, if she'd never come to that gala, never traced the paper—" "You wouldn't have found out," Sebastian said. "I built it too carefully. She is—" He glanced at Celeste where she stood behind Lorenzo, hand braced on a pylon, weight off her injured knee, watching him with eyes like dark fire. "She is extraordinary. I told her so. It is the one genuinely true thing I said tonight." "Her parents," Lorenzo said very quietly. A silence. "Business," Sebastian said. Lorenzo hit him once, just once. Open-handed, sharp across the face, not a brawler's strike, but the deliberate, calculated impact of a man who had determined exactly what level of force communicated exactly what he needed to communicate, which was, you are not worth more than this. You are not worth losing control over. Sebastian staggered, caught himself, his composure remarkably held. The police have everything, Celeste said from behind Lorenzo. Her voice was clear, absolutely clear. The financial trail, the arson payment, the wire fraud, the maritime acquisition documents. I sent them 40 minutes ago. Federal task force contact, not local. They'll be processing warrants within the hour. A beat. Sebastian, the financial case I built is airtight. You will go to prison. That's not a threat. It's accounting. Sebastian turned his eyes to her, and for the first time something cracked in them. Not remorse exactly, but something adjacent to it, the recognition of having been genuinely beaten. Remarkable, he said again softly. I know, she said. No heat in it. Just fact. Lorenzo stepped aside. Marco and two others moved forward. Sebastian went without struggle, which was perhaps the most honest thing he did that night. When they had him, Lorenzo turned back to Celeste and crossed to her in 3 steps and pulled her against his chest without asking, and she let him, her hands curling into his shirt, her forehead pressing against the solid warmth of him. He held her with both arms. Tight, real. His chin rested on her hair and he felt her breathing, measured, controlled. A woman who had not broken under the specific pressure that would have broken most people, and something in him that had been clenched since the moment he'd found her room empty finally released. You fought, he said against her hair. Of course I did, she said, muffled in his chest. I broke his nose. You broke his nose with a zip-tied hand. I've had worse constraints. She pulled back just enough to look up at him. Her eyes were wet at the corners, but her chin was steady. He used the old servant's passage. You should have told me about it. I will tell you about every passage in that house, he said. I will tell you about every underground tunnel and service corridor and hidden room in every property I own, I swear it. She almost smiled. Almost. One of us might die tonight, she said. And she meant not tonight. Tonight was survived, but the weight of what was still coming, the legal machinery she'd set in motion, the enemies Sebastian had made on Lorenzo's behalf, the final accounting that wasn't quite finished yet. Neither of us, he said, is going anywhere. He kissed her there, in the warehouse where her parents had died, with the smell of rust and river water, and the distant sound of sirens growing closer, and it was neither graceful nor cinematic. It was desperate and real. And it tasted like relief and something far too large to be named yet. Outside, the Mississippi moved on without them, indifferent and eternal. Inside, the beginning of after. 7 days. That was how long the federal investigation, the Vitelli family audit, and the dismantling of Sebastian Rossi's hidden financial architecture took to complete once Celeste handed the compiled case file to Special Agent Dorian Fontenot of the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. 7 days of depositions and document reviews and tense, careful conversations in federal conference rooms where Celeste sat on one side of a table and Lorenzo sat on the other, and they both told the truth about the parts they were asked about and were careful about the parts they weren't. Lorenzo's cooperation had been, as he put it over coffee the morning the agents arrived, strategically inevitable. You mean you calculated it? Celeste had said. I calculated that cooperating with the investigation into Sebastian's crimes was more beneficial than protecting a man who set fire to your parents' warehouse. Yes. He'd looked at her over his cup. I have been in this business long enough to know which battles to lose gracefully. And the rest of your business? She'd asked. Because she had to. He'd held her gaze. Adjustments are being made. She'd decided to accept that answer. For now. The reckoning, when it came, was thorough. Sebastian Rossi was arrested on a Tuesday morning at the lakefront airport, attempting to board a private charter to Costa Rica with $400,000 in a carry-on bag and approximately 0 remaining allies. The federal complaint named him on 11 counts spanning fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy to commit arson, 2 counts of murder in the 2nd degree, and 3 counts of witness tampering. He was processed efficiently and without drama, which was somehow more satisfying than drama would have been. Celeste sat in Special Agent Fontenot's office and received the confirmation by phone. She thanked the agent. She ended the call. She set the phone face down on the table and pressed her hands flat on its surface and breathed. Her tante Dominique, who had come 3 days ago and installed herself in the Vitelli estate kitchen with the confident authority of a woman who has survived everything and intends to survive the next thing too, put a cup of coffee in front of her and said nothing. The coffee was exactly right. "The fire investigator confessed," Celeste said. "I know, Chouette." "He said they never suffered." Her voice was careful. "The report said it was very fast." Dominique's hand came to her shoulder. Old hand, strong hand. The hand that had braided her hair when she was 8 and wiped her tears when she was 23 and made her eat when she forgot to eat and taught her that grief doesn't end. It just becomes something you carry differently. "Your mama and daddy knew you were going to be okay," Dominique said. "They raised you to be okay." Celeste let herself cry. 4 minutes. Precisely measured because she was her father's daughter and she did everything with precision, including grief. Then she dried her eyes, drank the coffee, and went to find Lorenzo. He was in the study. Where else? At his desk in shirt sleeves with his jacket over the chair and the photograph of his mother at the corner of his vision, going through what appeared to be organizational documents. The family was reorganizing. She gathered this in fragments, Marco stepping up. 3 consigliere candidates being evaluated. A significant portion of the Vitelli financial empire being restructured toward legitimate investment under the terms of the cooperation agreement. Lorenzo rebuilding, as he always did. He looked up when she came in. She told him. Sebastian, the airport, the charges, the fire investigator's confession. All of it. He listened without speaking. His face was very still. She watched him process it. The layered, complicated feeling of having been used for 30 years by the man he trusted most, of having been made an unknowing instrument in the destruction of people He stood up. He crossed the room. He pulled her against him, one arm around her shoulders, one hand at the back of her head, and he held her in the specific way she'd come to understand meant, "I have no words large enough for this, and so I am giving you weight and warmth instead." She let herself be held. Outside, Tante Dominique was almost certainly listening at the hallway door. But Celeste decided to give that 0 attention. "It's over," she said against his chest. "Part of it," he said. "The best part." She tilted her head back to look at him. "There are still the Mendez contracts to resolve, and the Harbor Authority audit, and approximately 47 things I found in the East Wing file cabinets that you and I are going to have a very frank conversation about. I know, and you owe me 6 weeks of salary, minimum, for the forensic work I've done for free in this house. I had a figure in mind. You'll find it offensive in its generosity." "I find money difficult to be offended by," she said. "It's just numbers." He smiled. Rare thing. Beautiful thing. The smile of a man who'd had very few genuine reasons to smile and meant it every time. He cupped her face. His thumbs against her cheeks, gray eyes steady and full of something that had been building for 3 weeks of morning calls and charity galas and gardenias and terrible danger. "Celeste Beaumont," he said. "Lorenzo Vitelli," she said back, matching his tone exactly. "I am going to make this right." Not a promise in the easy sense, in the weighted, costly, specific sense of a man who understood what right required. Your parents, their company, what was taken? His jaw tightened once. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making it right." "That's a long time," she said softly. "I'm aware," he said. "I intend to keep you nearby while I do it." It's finally over, she thought. And then immediately, because she'd always been precise, no. This is where it begins. She kissed him instead of saying either thing. He kissed her back like he'd been storing it up, which he had. 6 weeks later, the Garden District house on Prytania Street was fully renovated. Celeste had not asked for this. She'd mentioned, once, in a conversation about the Beaumont maritime assets being returned to her as the surviving heir, a legal process Lorenzo had personally funded and expedited with the specific energy of a man burning, down bureaucracy by sheer force of will, that the old family house had been sitting empty since the fire, that she'd been paying a caretaker to maintain it, though she hadn't been able to bring herself to go inside. 3 weeks later, he'd handed her a key. "What is this?" she'd asked. "Your house?" he'd said. "Restored. The original floors, the original kitchen tile, the gardenia beds replanted. I had photographs from a historical society." He'd paused. "I also had the warehouse on the river demolished." She'd stood very still. "The foundation is a public garden now," he'd added, with a marker. He'd placed a photograph in her hand, a simple granite stone, understated, set in a garden bed of white gardenias and Louisiana iris. Amélie and Jacques Beaumont. Beloved, forever home in this city they loved. She'd had to sit down. She'd had to sit down and hold the photograph, and practice the breathing that got harder sometimes before it got easier. He'd sat beside her, silent, present, offering nothing but his warmth and his weight and the absolute reliability of him that she had somehow, over these weeks of violence and grief and revelation, come to lean on without realizing she was leaning. The New Orleans evening was doing its languid best around them. Heat and cricket song and the distant trumpet from a bar on Magazine Street, the smell of Confederate jasmine and river, and everything that was both beautiful and melancholy about this city that was theirs. "The family accepted you," she said, not quite changing the subject. "The family is currently more afraid of you than of me," Lorenzo said, "which I find appropriate." "Gilles told me I run the numbers like a don," she said. "I'm taking that as a compliment." He meant it as one. "Gil has been in this family for 17 years and has never said anything complimentary about anyone." A pause. "He thinks you're the reason the quarterly accounts are suddenly accurate to within $50. "They're accurate to within $11, she corrected. "Of course they are." The family had, in fact, come around with the specific pragmatism of people who understood power. Celeste had proven herself useful, intelligent, and genuinely unbothered by the nature of the business, which was more than could be said for most people Lorenzo had ever brought into his orbit. Marco treated her with the loyal affection of a large, dangerous golden retriever who had decided she was now also pack. Gilles had taught her how the household security system worked. The others had followed. Tante Dominique had cooked for all of them 3 times now and shown absolutely zero interest in leaving, which Lorenzo had responded to with a politeness that told Celeste, in the precise way she read everything about him, that he found her aunt's presence genuinely comforting in a way he would never in 1,000 years admit to. Celeste watched him now, sitting beside her in the evening light, jacket off, sleeves rolled, looking out at the city with the expression of a man who had spent 15 years carrying something very heavy and was only just beginning to understand. He could set it down. She thought about what she was going to say. She'd been thinking about it for a week. "I want to expand Beaumont Financial Forensics," she said. "Take on clients in the legitimate corporate sector. Build it into something my father would recognize." A breath. "And I want to keep doing what I've been doing here. Restructuring your accounts, ensuring the transition to legitimate revenue streams actually happens, not just on paper." Lorenzo looked at her. "You want to work for me?" "With you," she said, "there's a distinction. I'm aware of the distinction." The corner of his mouth. "What are your terms?" 60% on all accounts I personally audit. Full access to every financial record in every entity, monthly reports to a regulatory compliance officer of my choosing. She met his eyes. "And you stop running certain operations entirely, not just on paper." "I've already begun that process." "I know. I've seen the books." She held his gaze. "I need you to finish it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her, and she held the look, because she was Celeste Beaumont, and she did not flinch from things that mattered. "I need you to understand," he said slowly, "that there are elements of what I am that do not disappear with a restructuring plan. There are men who are loyal to me for reasons that exist outside ledger lines. There is protection I provide to this city that no government entity will take over if I stop." A pause. "I am not asking you to accept everything without question. I am asking you to know that the man you are accepting is not fully separable from the empire." "I know that," she said. And I'm a forensic accountant," she said. I don't expect things to be clean, I expect them to be honest. She searched his face. Be honest with me, that's my term. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. She blinked. He was holding something, small, dark, wrapped in a cloth. He unwrapped it with the careful, deliberate hands of a man who was not used to fumbling and was very determined not to start. The ring was extraordinary. Old gold warmed to amber by age with a dark ruby at its center surrounded by small diamonds. Not a modern engagement ring. Not a piece from a store. Old Vitelli gold, she understood, looking at it, the kind of piece that had been in a family for generations. This was my mother's, he said. Her mother's before that. He held it without offering it, looking at it. It has been in the Vitelli family for 112 years. It has outlasted every stupid decision this family ever made. He looked up. I would like it to go forward. She felt her throat close. I'll also note, he said, and the dry note in his voice was there, the thing she loved, the thing that had made her answer the phone again and again on rainy New Orleans mornings, that if you say no, I will almost certainly kidnap you again and keep trying until you say yes, which you may find a compelling reason to simply say yes the first time. She laughed, real and full and helpless. That is the worst proposal I have ever heard, she said. It's the only one I've ever made, he said. I'm working without precedent. She held out her hand. He placed the ring on her finger with both hands, like it was the most important thing he'd ever done. And it sat there warm and heavy and right in the specific way that things are right when they are not coincidence but conclusion, when they are the logical end of a chain of events that began, perhaps, with a phone call on a rainy morning, or perhaps with a charity gala and a woman who moved like she had places to be, or perhaps long before that, in the particular machinery of a city that makes its own rules and its own destinies. Marry me, he said, or I'll kidnap you. Those are the options. Marry you, she said. Those are my terms. He kissed her in the garden on Prytania Street, while the jasmine climbed and the fountain ran and the city breathed around them, the same city it had always been, beautiful and dangerous and utterly theirs. Marco, who had driven them there and had been waiting in the car with the focused patience of a man pretending very hard not to be listening, let out a breath he'd been holding for 6 weeks. In the front seat, he allowed himself a small smile. Finally, he thought. About time. 9 months later. The wedding was a New Orleans wedding, meaning it lasted 3 days. The ceremony was held at St. Louis Cathedral on a Thursday evening, the cathedral lit by 500 candles, the air thick with jasmine and beeswax, and the particular sacred weight of an old building that had witnessed 300 years of this city's joys and catastrophes and had survived all of them. Celeste walked down the aisle in ivory silk that moved like water, her tante Dominique holding her arm, her mother's gardenias woven through her hair, white and cream and impossibly sweet. Lorenzo stood at the altar in black, and when she came through the doors and he saw her, the look on his face was the kind of look that gets talked about for decades. Marco, standing to his right, did not cry. He was emphatic about this later. What happened was a dust particle. A very specific and poorly timed dust particle, which explained everything. The officiant read the traditional vows. Lorenzo and Celeste had added 2 lines of their own, one each, agreed upon after a negotiation that had taken 4 evenings and considerable amounts of bourbon. His, I will be honest with you. That is my oath, above all others. Hers, I will find every number in every dark place and bring it to light. For us, and for this family, and for the city that is ours. Simple. Theirs. Exact. The reception spilled from the ballroom of the Windsor Court onto the street below in the way that New Orleans receptions inevitably do, the music shifting from a string quartet to a jazz second line at approximately 9:30 p.m. when the trumpet player from a bar on Frenchman Street materialized at the ballroom door and the entire wedding party poured into the street to follow him down Royal Street with umbrellas and handkerchiefs and the specific, sacred, joyful noise of a city celebrating its own. Celeste danced in the street in her ivory silk with gardenias slipping from her hair, and Lorenzo's hand warm at her waist, and the city swirled around them, warm and loud and improbably beautiful, and she thought about her parents the way she always thought about them, not with the sharp grief of absence, but with the deeper, warmer knowledge that they had built her well enough to find her way here, to this man, to this city, to this specific and improbable happiness. They would have liked him, she thought, watching him laugh at something Marco said, real laughter, the rare kind. My father would have argued with him for years and respected him completely. My mother would have made him gardenia tea and asked him impossible questions until he answered all of them honestly. She smiled. He caught her eye across the circle of dancers, and the smile that answered hers was everything. All of it. The morning calls and the gardenias and the warehouse and the ring that had lived in a family for 112 years and sat now on her hand like it had always known where it was going. 3 months prior, she had opened the reconstituted Beaumont Financial Forensics on Prytania Street, 3 doors down from where her parents' house stood fully restored. The firm operated in both legitimate corporate forensic accounting and, quietly, in the kind of financial architecture that kept a reorganizing crime empire clean. She employed 6 people. She was negotiating a consulting contract with 2 federal agencies that did not advertise their consulting arrangements. The Vitelli empire was not, categorically, gone. It was changed. Restructured, leaner and more selective and pointed with much greater precision at targets that, when examined through Celeste's particular lens, were difficult to argue were undeserving. The Port Authority operated without the corruption that had been Sebastian Rossi's personal garden for 20 years. 3 city councilmen had, in the weeks following Sebastian's arrest, quietly announced they would not seek re-election. The docking rights dispute with the Mendez operation had been resolved through a combination of financial agreement and the specific persuasiveness of Lorenzo, accompanied by Marco, and the implicit understanding that this was a final conversation. Detective Ray Thibodeau had called Lorenzo twice in the months since, once to tell him that Sebastian's case was proceeding through federal court with no complications, once to say, simply, that the books on Amélie and Jacques Beaumont's deaths were now closed, as solved. The fire was ruled arson. The responsible party was in custody. The case that had haunted Celeste for 8 years had its ending. She had cried that day, in private, for exactly as long as she needed to, and then she'd gone to meet Lorenzo for dinner at the restaurant on Magazine Street where they'd had their first real date, not counting the charity gala, which she maintained was a professional meeting, and she'd told him, and he'd covered her hand with his on the white tablecloth, and they'd sat with it together the way you sit with things that are too large and too real for words, but too important to put down. Some things, she'd thought that night, you don't get over. You get through. And getting through is its own kind of grace. Now, in the street, the trumpet carried the melody up into the warm Louisiana night, and Celeste turned to find Lorenzo behind her, his arms coming around her from behind, his chin dropping to her shoulder, his voice low in her ear. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything," she said. "Be more specific." "You." "My parents. The fact that you danced for 45 minutes and your face during the first 20 minutes looked like someone performing a hostile corporate takeover. Dancing is not in my skill set." "You've improved," she said, because he had. "I have an excellent teacher." His arms tightened, and a great deal of motivation. The trumpet soared, the crowd swayed. Somewhere in the crush, Tante Dominique was doing a second line with a man in a purple suit who appeared to be absolutely delighted by the encounter. "I'm pregnant," Celeste said. She felt him go very still, not with fear, not with the specific quality of stillness that meant calculation or concern, with something entirely different. Something that came from somewhere deep and unguarded in a man who had lost his parents young and rebuilt a family from loyalty and obligation and had never quite let himself want the biological kind. She turned in his arms to look at him. His face was open, fully, completely open, the gray eyes wide and bright with something she'd only seen a handful of times and treasured every single one. Lorenzo Vitelli, without his armor on. "When?" he said. "How?" 7 weeks, she said. "How is the traditional way? I'm told it's fairly standard." He laughed. The real laugh, the rare one. He pulled her in against his chest, both arms tight around her. His face pressed into her hair, and she felt the full weight of him trembling slightly, which was the most honest thing Lorenzo Vitelli had ever done in her presence, which was saying something. A child, he said against her hair. Yes. In this family, she confirmed, which is going to be fine, because I have seen the books and the restructuring is going remarkably well, and our child will be raised in a city they love by parents who love them, and a Tante Dominique who will teach them to make red beans and rice, and a very large man named Marco who will carry them on his shoulder until they are approximately 12. A breath, and a father, Lorenzo said, who was not. He stopped. She waited. He rarely stopped like this. Who was not made for this kind of life? The soft kind. The kind where something could be taken. Another breath. But who wants it? Very badly. With you. She held his face in her hands. His face. Hard-angled and storm-eyed and beautiful in the specific way of things that have endured extraordinary pressure and come through still standing. You were made exactly for this, she told him. You just didn't have anyone to make it with. He kissed her in the street, in the music, in the gold and noise of their city, and the crowd around them caught it and went up in a cheer that the trumpet player incorporated into the melody without missing a beat, because this was New Orleans, and New Orleans always knew when to celebrate. The gardenias in her hair smelled like her mother's garden. The ring on her finger had been worn by women who survived 100 years of this family's history. The man holding her had brought flowers to a lobby because a woman stopped answering his calls and had waited in the marble light for her to choose him. She had chosen him. She would keep choosing him. Every morning, every call, every impossible number in every dark account. She would bring it to light, and he would stand beside her, and the city would go on being the beautiful, dangerous, extraordinary thing it had always been. This is the Vitelli Empire, she thought, looking out at the street, the music, the people who had loved Lorenzo long enough and carefully enough to be here now. And this, all of this, is mine. She turned back to him. Marry me, she said, echoing him full circle, the best kind of circle. I already did, he said, 3 hours ago, in a cathedral, in front of a priest and 400 people. I know, she said. I wanted to say it anyway. He smiled, and in that smile, in that rare, uncalculated, completely unguarded smile, was every morning call and every unanswered phone and every gardenia and every piece of broken glass and every number and every ledger and every moment of fire and grief and reckoning and love that had built them, separately and then together, into exactly what they were. His, hers, home.